So first things first, who are you? What's your role and where do you work?
Yeah, so my name's Phil Estes. I'm a principal engineer at Amazon Web Services, and I currently work on the open source strategy team, leading our open source strategy around container technology and cloud native.
And how did you first come in touch with Cloud Native and Kubernetes?
I guess my initial introduction to this space really goes back to the early days of Docker, the Docker engine, and the Docker tooling. I got interested in it just as a project and started contributing to the Docker open source project. Got very involved, became a maintainer. And of course, Docker became the initial container runtime that was used by Kubernetes. And I'm sure we can get into it. But out of that came Containerd, which was donated to the CNCF. And I was part of launching that container runtime project that became the basis for a lot of Kubernetes installations over the years.
And just to walk folks through it that maybe weren't aware of the story of Containerd, what was it like at that point when it wasn't sure necessarily how things were going to go? The community was growing at that point, but perhaps there wasn't 100% certainty about the direction in terms of adoption, things of that nature.
Definitely very interesting days. If you go all the way back to like 2014, 2015, and then into the couple years after that, Kubernetes was around in those early days of Docker, but it was really I guess 2016, 2017, when things like the CNCF were created, Kubernetes was donated as that first initial project. And then there were actually a fairly strong set of conflicts and just kind of friction around these communities, the Docker engine, and some different ideas about how container orchestration should be architected, and Docker came out with their own ideas. So really Containerd came out of this desire to have sort of this common core that wasn't beholden to Docker, the company, or the Docker project that had its own orchestration technology built into it. So Containerd is really a success story of a bunch of people who were in this moment of friction and some conflict, and coming up with a solution that sort of solved everyone's problems. Docker could still have this base to build their product on. Kubernetes could have this core runtime engine that didn't have these other orchestration concepts. So so I was really happy that out of that kind of tense moment, Containerd came and really became very successful by being a very simple and small core runtime that could be used by anybody, including Kubernetes.
And now fast forwarding to nowadays, this ecosystem moves very quickly. What works best for you to stay up to date on all the changes that are happening?
Oh, yeah, great question. I mean, events are a huge part of that. Being at KubeCon and Open Source Summit and some of the Kubernetes community days. That's where, between talks and maybe sometimes the more important hall track, that's where you really find out where people are heading, what new things people are trying. But it's been interesting to see kind of the waves over the years of kind of new ideas. Networking and CNI were huge, and all these startups came in that space. Security was a huge thing, and a bunch of new startups came in that space. And now we have sort of the AI wave and everything that's related to that. So it's, I guess, two answers. It's impossible to keep up, and yet, I think staying very connected to the community, seeing what other people are up to. I'm not huge on keeping up with aggregators and news services, but those people connections and CNCF Slack, that's where the chatter is that kind of keeps me up to date.
And in terms of people in the ecosystem, could you give us an example of one or two people that helped you level up?
Yeah, actually, a name immediately comes to mind, who sadly is not really very visible anymore. But Michael Crosby was an early Docker engine maintainer and early employee of Docker. Super quiet, but like his code is in everything that we're using today in the cloud native stack. And he quietly just did tons of work. But I had the opportunity in those early days to just sit with him in person and get his guidance on like sort of how to be a good contributor, how to think about what to work on next. And yeah, I definitely credit him with sort of launching my open source career and chops. Yeah, so he was huge influence. There were others at the time. Jess Frizzell was also a Docker at the time, but she was at the other end of the spectrum. She was extremely well known. Twitter was the big thing then, and she had like 90K followers. And she and Kelsey Hightower were coming of age at that point, just super popular at conferences. Their talks were packed. But anyway, Jess and even Kelsey were part of that early Docker community and gave me a lot of guidance, and were just awesome people to kind of follow in their footsteps.
And, we're talking to a lot of different people, and when we ask the question about what is Kubernetes, we get different answers. There is no right or wrong answer. But Phil, in your case, what is Kubernetes for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think because I started in the container runtime space, like Kubernetes is that set of APIs and constructs that takes this concept of containers and container runtimes and allows you to orchestrate it across, in the early days, a smaller number, but now tens of thousands of nodes, so that you can effectively distribute your workload across, cloud data centers, private data centers. And so Kubernetes brought this kind of next layer of orchestration on technology that had already popularized. Hey, we could put our software in containers, and it's super easy to push to registries and pull to servers and run our workloads. Kubernetes, came and kind of brought this completely additional layer of capability to containers that let people do, as we can see today, amazing things with orchestration. And every cloud provider in the world now has a Kubernetes offering, and so it became the de facto standard for how we orchestrate across a set of nodes.
And going back, you're mentioning, your early contributions getting involved in Containerd. What were those initial steps like where you decided, oh, this is a good place for me. I'm going to go from contributor to maintainer. Was there a moment that you really decided, this is something I want to get, more into? What was it about the experience that attracted you?
So yeah, my first experience with that was Docker and then Containerd. So a lot of my early experiences were, again, just kind of initially just pointed at this community by my employer at the time, like, hey, containers are obviously taking off. Like, it's obviously an open source project. You should go get involved and see. I'd had a history of Linux packaging and Linux distro technology in my role at the time. And so I kind of jumped in. It was the first time I'd been around open source at that point for 10 years. Like I said, I was packaging Linux distros. I was involved in, communities in the sense of like taking the output of communities and putting that together with other software. But I think what really grabbed me about the experience in Docker is just this excitement of like, I created a code change and this community reviewed it and thought it was valuable and accepted it into the project. And as simple as that sounds, like there was kind of this dopamine effect of like, wow, that was fun. I'm going to do that again. And now I'm going to do that again. And at some point, it just became clear that I was becoming much more knowledgeable about the whole code base as I contributed small bug fixes and bits of changes here and there, that it just became clear, like, I love working in this code base. I could help maintain it. And so I think it wasn't like a particular point or moment, but it was more like, this is where I'm pouring my time and effort into, and I'd love to be on the other side of like helping make this project successful.
And for folks that are out there, that maybe are interested in becoming contributors as opposed to ones that are maintainers, the different roles in participation, how do you see that, is there a question of status, of people taking you seriously, of going from one to the other? Perhaps not everyone's cut out to have one role or another. For people that, are curious about getting involved, what are things they should keep keep in mind if they want to be a contributor or take making the jump to becoming a maintainer?
So I guess a couple different things on that. One is that I have always told people who want to get involved in communities, go find where that community hangs out and meet who's involved. Like, obviously in the virtual world we live in, that could be Slack, some older open source projects. It's still like an email group, that you send messages to. But hopefully that's somewhere that you can like see the interactions of that community. Some of that lives on GitHub with maintainers responding to contributors or having discussions there. I find that early contributors succeed way faster when they sort of get involved in the community rather than sort of just lob over, like, here's my first contribution and nobody's ever heard of this person, never kind of interacted with them. And it's hard to know, like, what's your purpose? Like, do you just like our project? And again, there's some great kind of drive-by contributions in small ways. So that's one thing, is like find where that community is and like figure out who's who. Like I did that in the early days of Docker and other projects. And that was super helpful because then I knew who to ask for help. The second aspect is to recognize that communities need all kinds of help, and it's not always just code contributions. I think my best story here is that this guy Sebastian showed up in the Docker community one day, and he's like, I don't know Go yet. Like, I'm probably not going to contribute code, but I'd love to help you guys organize your issues. And he became like this encyclopedia of every open issue. Like, he knew everything about what was open. Someone would open a new issue and he's like, hey, I think you're having the same issue as person A. Like, let me link you to their issue. Like, he became this encyclopedia. He became this librarian. And now he's a Docker employee. Like, he manages, and he's a Containerd reviewer. So like, he just made himself so useful by just pitching in to like help with like a huge load of issues and bug reports. There's people say it all the time, but documentation is so hard to keep up to date in these projects that are moving fast. So if you're a good writer, if you know how to think well about how someone might read a getting started guide and find ways that too much jargon is being used or too much assumptions are being made about what a new user might already know. So those are super helpful ways to get involved in communities. That doesn't mean I need to know everything about the code or I need to be deeply technical about this project. I think there's multiple ways you can jump in, and also, like I said in the first point, like find out who's around in that community and make a friend and see what they need help with. Those are great ways to get involved.
And over your career, you've mentored lots of different people and helped shape newcomers. For other folks that are out there that maybe have recently become maintainers, are there things that they should keep in mind to create a culture of where people feel open to ask questions, where they feel that they can reach out and ask for help and get those resources? Are there any recommendations you would share, or also common mistakes to avoid?
Yeah, I think we've talked about this a lot in the Containerd community. When something's virtual, like it takes extra effort to make a community feel welcoming. There's no doormat, there's no room you walk into, and so how do you make people feel like we're willing to accept whatever you have to offer, your expertise with documentation, and so trying to be super, whenever I see in GitHub, like this is a first time contributor, it gives you that little hint, when someone opens their first issue or first pull request. We can sometimes, because we're all busy, we can be short in our responses, but I like to tend to be overly wordy, if you will, just to like make sure they know, hey, thanks so much for opening an issue, or thanks for finding this, or hey, I'd like to help you. You didn't sign your commit, but we have a little guide over here that'll help you figure that out, or please reach back out to me. Like just being overly emphatic about, we're glad you're here. We're glad you're trying to help out, even if they did it the wrong way or they didn't follow the guide. And so I think that's super important for communities is to realize that, everyone's human. And so, trying to take that extra step to make sure that they feel welcome in the community, feel like we want them to be there. I think those are super important. And I'm sure we've done poorly at that sometimes just because we're all busy. But that's my kind of recommendation and guidance is to, when someone tries to reach out or tries to do something, like that's a great touch point to say, hey, thanks for showing up and helping out. I know it takes time and we'd love to help you be successful here. So, yeah.
And you've worked deeply on the technical side, but you've also, been involved speaking publicly and being involved in, being vocal about the projects that you're working on. How do you find the balance between deep engineering contributions and visible non-code work? I know you mentioned, already the essential nature of, having good documentation, but also, blog posts, speaking, community organization, et cetera. And for folks that are out there, sometimes people might struggle with one, they might struggle with the other, they may struggle with both. What advice would you give, though, to folks that really want to be able to do both sides of this in terms of the deep technical contributions, but then also on the side of, giving talks, creating content, things of that nature?
Yeah. First of all, just recognizing it's a hard balance to do both well. It's funny, like I did a bunch of initial deep technical work in Docker. I implemented user namespaces, which at the time was something people had wanted, but no one had sort of done all the work. And so I did all the work and it was difficult. And to get that finally over the finish line took forever. And then it's like, man, I want to tell everyone about user namespaces and why you should use them. And so I started submitting talks and talks and talks, to conferences and getting some accepted. And so I find it, sometimes it's just an ebb and flow. Like sometimes if, there's a bunch of work to do and it means I probably won't have time to submit every talk that I want to do or write every blog post. But the cool thing is by doing some really great work, it gives you some awesome stuff to then go talk about. And so that's kind of been the phases I've gone through is like, okay, here's some new stuff I want to do. And through that, I'm starting to think, hey, it'd be cool to be able to talk about it in this way, how it applies to this. Maybe I can submit that to the next KubeCon. So yeah, it takes some extra effort because, then I've got to think about CFPs and when those are due and get all that lined up. But to me, I think the awesome thing about having some deep technical work under your belt is that your talk can be more relatable to developers and engineers in that, I'm not just pitching something that my company's doing or, this is stuff I actually did and I want to share like things I learned and how I hit this roadblock and overcame it with this solution. And so those talks tend to be more exciting to me than just kind of generally talking about a random topic. So I think they can go hand in hand, but definitely there's no magic bullet. It takes some extra effort to think about how this will turn into some talks and a blog post and however else I want to share that content.
And you know, throughout the course of your experience in contributing to open source, what's one lesson about building a reputation that you didn't expect, something that only became clear after years of being involved?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the most interesting thing about that is that I never expected to be, well, I'll put it this way, stepping back to like all the work I did, I'm getting older, you can tell by my gray hair. I worked for 15 years before open source, 15 to 20. And so no one outside of the company I was in or even the teams I was working with knew anything about me or what I did. And I think what was crazy, now that I'm over 10 years, 12 years into an open source career that did give me opportunity to talk at a lot of conferences and share a lot of information about Containerd and about the project history and about Docker and Kubernetes. When I joined AWS, 4.5 years ago, it was, and maybe there's a humble brag. Well, I'll take it if it is. But to have like some younger Amazonians like send me a message on Slack like, wow, I can't believe you're here. Like I've watched every one of your talks. I learned so much about containers from you. And like that was really rewarding to think, okay, that didn't come after one talk or two talks or 1 year or 2 years. That's a decade doing the work of generating content, of speaking at conferences. That in this environment, like as I said, I worked 20 years and no one ever came up to me and said, hey, I love what you do and I've watched your talks or whatever, because I wasn't doing that. And so, yeah, it's kind of crazy to think in this environment, and I'm no Kelsey Hightower or Joe Beta or any of those people, but the cool thing is like I've had an impact. I've helped people learn things, and it took a slog of like a lot of like boring things, like working on some difficult problems and just crunching away on maintainer tasks. But yeah, to me that was a cool feeling of like, okay, all that added up to a reputation of, hey, you help people learn things about containers and cloud native. And so, I never expected, like I never set out like, oh, that's what I want. I want people to walk up to me and say, hey, I learned something from you. But kind of a cool outcome. Like you said, it wasn't after it took a long time to experience that, but yeah, pretty amazing that because our community is open and we can share openly and we can write and publish and share videos, like, to have that kind of experience is pretty unique.
And I think a big lesson is that we see with a lot of newcomers in the ecosystem is that they might be expecting a turnaround, of 2 months or something like that, that's just going to be skyrocketed to a keynote stage or things like that. And as with most things in life, these things take time. And as someone that's been in the ecosystem now for 5 years, you start to see the impact of things that you did in the beginning, start to bear fruit, and other things that will probably take even longer. So I definitely echo what you've shared there, and that a lot of the stuff that's, heads down and isn't necessarily the most glamorous, those are the things that help you build relationships with people that will stay around forever. And I also think too is that as you said, you're not Kelsey Hightower or Joe Beta, but don't need to be. That's their job. They get to do that, and that's great. And so everyone has their own way to contribute and their own story to share.